So welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Lindsey, for coming to talk to us today. I think as many of you already know Lindsey, but she's the representative for the human impacts of climate change at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. And Lindsey joined QUNO in 2013 with a background in peace work, following a career in conflict zones from Northern Ireland, the Israeli-occupied West Bank, former Yugoslavia, Somalia, and Gaza. And Lindsey's work at QUNO focuses on climate change and environmental degradation as a peace and justice concern, engaging at an international level with the climate change negotiations, climate science, the human rights efforts, whilst also seeking to connect the international process with the grassroots efforts and Quakers around the world. She's a member of German Yearly Meeting and lives in Bonn, where QUNO has an office space. We are holding this conversation today to help us understand more about Quaker work at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and how this relates to friends all around the world. FWCC is the world body for the Religious Society of Friends. We represent around 400,000 Quakers in 87 different countries. And FWCC holds the general consultative status at the United Nations, which gives the Quaker United Nations offices in Geneva and New York, which are known as QUNO, and I will refer to them as that. It gives them the highest level of accreditation at the UN, and through this, QUNO acts on Quaker concerns at the United Nations. And in recent months, QUNO has been actively engaged in the negotiations to agree the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which will be presented later this year. And this 6th assessment report has taken over 7 years to develop, and it involves hundreds of scientists and experts from around the world. And it collates all the most up-to-date climate science to inform governments on what's happening and what they can do about it. And the reports have a legal status, and they have been used in the past by citizens to hold governments to account for insufficient action on climate change. In February this year, the IPCC finalised the second part of the 6th assessment report on impact, adaptation and vulnerability. And during the negotiations, Lindsey made 27 interventions on behalf of Quakers before hundreds of country delegates and scientists. And at the end of March this year, the IPCC met once again to approve the 3rd section of the report, which is on mitigation. And this time, Lindsey made 35 oral interventions and 11 written submissions, which is more than ever before in an IPCC meeting. And for the session today, I have prepared some questions in advance to ask Lindsey, but then for the second half of the session, we will open up and take questions from all of you in the audience. And we've also had some which have been sent to us in advance, which we will be starting with. So I think, without further ado, I would like to welcome Lindsey, and I will dive straight in with my first question, but please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself before you start answering, if you wish.
Greetings all. Thank you, Susanna.
So my first question, Lindsey, is really to get more of a sense of what happens. So can you describe what it's actually like to be in the negotiations for those of us who aren't there? So for example, how do states interact with NGO observer organizations like us?
Thank you. I want to answer that question just giving you a taste of the different UN environments in which we work, so that you can understand why the IPCC is actually quite unique in the access. Because at the climate change negotiations, the UNFCCC, Quakers are actually, our work for FWCC and the QUNO, Quaker United Nations office, is unique because we have quiet diplomacy meetings with negotiators at the climate change negotiations. But otherwise, in the climate change negotiations, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, It's very difficult for observers to engage except in the corridors with diplomats, with what we call delegates. And also they don't even listen to the groups of NGOs until very much at the beginning. They are allowed to give a statement, so we're part of something called Research and Independent. They give a statement, and then at the very end, after 2 weeks, for example, of a COP or something, and by that time you can see all the negotiators leaving the room. In the Human Rights Council, for example, under FWCC, we can make an official statement during the Human Rights Council, and that statement is actually approved by, we have a sign-off with other Quaker organizations. It's quite official, 90 seconds. And it's filmed and it's in the room with delegates. Again, though, for QUNO, the way we work with diplomats is often inviting them to Quaker House and having this safe space to discuss. So we often have a different way of engaging rather than in the public space. But the IPCC is very unusual because the IPCC is a space where they meet to approve what's called a summary for policymakers. So they have this huge climate science report, which is coming out now. It's taken them up to 7 years to create this. The last one came out in 2013, 2014, before we were observers. This one has come out, and in these summaries, so of 40 pages to represent thousands of pages of climate science, they go through it paragraph by paragraph for the states to approve. The beautiful thing that I love about the IPCC is that states cannot change language if it challenges the integrity of the scientific findings. So you have this red flag that you don't have in the climate change negotiations. And so after each paragraph of discussion, observers are allowed to speak. And that's why we are constantly giving these interventions after discussions. And of course, it takes them 2 weeks to often approve the final piece. So you're working on these paragraphs and working on language and fighting to keep language in or to bring language in. So that's the access. It is highly unusual because of our ability to speak. And then also I'm WhatsApping with negotiators. So there's certain states I know from our Paris Agreement climate change. And there's certain states that I know will to listen to us on some things, but not on others. So I choose for certain issues to ask for their support on these things. So, and then also the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights, so which is in Geneva, the OHCHR. We help them become observers. We help them get through the process and understand, and we prepped them. And they were active for the first time in both February for this report on adaptation and human impact. So what happens to us with climate change? And this last report on mitigation, which is how do we act? How do we do it, right? And so we were working on rights-based language together. And I was also using them to help bring in, but I was also highlighting for them when they needed to come in because they were running ragged on different UN meetings happening all over the place. So that's what we're able to do and why the access is so unusual. And we have influenced language, helped change language, helped stop states from taking out language. It's a very political space. And just finally, to give a bit of background, the reason that we wanted to join the IPCC, we were communicating their climate science anyway I put a little 15 points for negotiators about what you should know from the latest report. But the IPCC saw how interested we were, and they said, would you like to be an observer? We only have about 100 observers and not many come. But the other thing was that the Paris Agreement had happened. And in that language, it said that it committed to keeping temperature limit below 2°C and pursuing efforts to hold to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And I was going to meetings where they were discussing how do we do this? And the emphasis was on technical fixes, carbon capture storage, blah, 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 and not on sustainable lifestyles, consumption, our economic systems. The political pressure was not there to talk about the elephants in the room in the way that we felt was needed. So we asked Gretchen, who was then FWCC General Secretary, would she like us to be observers? And she was full supportive. And so in order to go to these meetings, Tim signs a letter asking for us to attend, and we are there as FWCC. But because FWCC is such a tricky acronym for people from non-native English speaking countries to say, we are called, in February, the co-chairs called us the Quakers. So you can imagine in front of hundreds of diplomats and scientists, and now we have the Quakers. And in the last meeting, which was on mitigation, the co-chair is Scottish, and he knows us as the Friends, and we've known him for some time. And so it was, and now we have the Friends speaking. So I wanted to share that because it's quite remarkable.
Thank you, Lindsey. That's a very helpful starting point for us. You were talking about the interventions and the language, and I wonder, are there examples of the interventions you make at the negotiations leading directly to the strengthening of the messages in the final report? Other examples that you can share?
Yes, so on the QUNO website, we have uploaded what we said in our statements, in our interventions, and what responses there were. So if you're interested in specifics, you can go there. The second one is 12 pages long with 35 interventions plus 11. But for specific examples, for example, there is political pressure by countries that do not want to reduce their fossil fuel extraction to remove references that are about suffering, about pulling out the word sustainable, trying to push in carbon capture storage, but not talk about renewables. It can be quite breathtaking sometimes what they're doing. So examples of what we did, we really pushed on questioning technical fixes that were being proposed in ways when they aren't actually up and functioning. And we questioned very much how climate justice, so in this last report about how do we reduce, was terrifying to me because the final summary presented had no mention of climate justice, had no mention of Indigenous people's rights, had no mention of human rights. And these words we wanted to ground in, and human rights-based approaches, which is about protecting biodiversity, protecting youth, including meaningful participation in decision-making. This is the kind of work we do. So we got climate justice in this last report when it wasn't even there. We got Indigenous people's rights in there. We got from gender, I think it was gender concerns to gender equality, which shocked me because I thought certain states, such as our friends in Saudi Arabia, were going to wipe that one out, but I think they were fighting other battles at the time. We got, and again, this may sound scary, but the word sustainable wasn't always in a sentence where it should have been. So we got the word sustainable before agriculture in certain sentences. In the middle report, which was in February on adaptation, human impact, there was a lot of resistance to the connection between climate change and conflict. And it's actually something that QUNO works on quite thoroughly. And we were the only observer and one of the only voices to really emphasize that what the authors were saying was reflecting the research, and it was correct and it was needed. But one of the interesting things there was the way the authors had phrased it made it sound like conflict only happened because of social and economic problems. And by the time they were trying to finalize that language, it was in what's called a huddle, super, super confidential. We can observe, but we're not allowed to speak. So I was actually texting to one of the countries to push for questioning that, to say there are political reasons for conflicts, there are human rights abuses in conflicts, there are reasons beyond social and economic of why people are killing each other. And if we don't have that language in, we have a sentence which kind of defines conflict in a limited way. And we actually, it was actually the US. The US has been very helpful on some things and a real tricky part on other things, but the US helped push for non-climatic factors, non-climate factors, which feed conflict. And I give you that example because that sentence was quoted back to me in a meeting in Geneva with sort of wider states and the IPCC explaining this latest report, and they were quoting sentences that we helped influence to make sure it's clear and that it's covering the many areas. So those are some examples.
Thank you. My next question is, you've just mentioned some of the elephants in the room, and can you tell us more specifically about some of the challenges in pressing for urgent, fair and transformative climate action to address the often very lucrative root causes driving climate change?
So to start with, as you can all imagine, I mean, the main drivers of climate change and environmental degradation and destruction are often very lucrative activities. A few people make a lot of money off them. And in many states in that room, their economies, most states, are completely dependent on unsustainable consumption, unsustainable economic growth, fossil fuel dependence, deforestation, you name it. So you're in a room where you're actually asking these states to approve language which is questioning the underlying foundations of their economic system. So we are constantly working to protect the scientist language on reducing rapid reduction of fossil fuel use, and extraction and burning. Really making sure that when it refers to agriculture, it's about sustainable agriculture. We pushed in for agroecology, this kind of small-scale protection of small-scale farmers, protection to indigenous people's lands so that they have a right in the decision-making, and diet. Now, you will not find meat and dairy mentioned once in the summary, but it will be in the underlying text, the thousands of pages. And I just want to say, if you want to quote the IPCC reports to your MPs or your representatives, wherever you are in the world, you can quote the underlying text. Those are the scientific summaries of the latest science. There's no problem. You don't have to just look at this 40-page summary. But the 40-page summary is what is read by most people. So what we do have, we have sustainable and healthy diets, and a footnote to that being mostly plant-based. Politically, we couldn't get meat and dairy in there. But what's fascinating, I had a spar-off with the co-chair, who they were trying to cut the word sustainable from healthy diets. And again, I was doing so many interventions, probably speaking more than any. There are only 3 observers who really speak, myself, FWCC, the European Union, and Climate Action Network, which actually represents hundreds of NGOs, but they are only allowed one person who speaks, the head of delegation. So there's this bizarre situation. But we actually said, I said, look, healthy diet is a subjective. Your version of a healthy diet is different from mine. We cannot cut the word sustainable. So it's basic things like that that we're fighting for. And making sure that they do not weaken. Some states really want to weaken the language of rapid reduction of fossil fuels, the importance of pushing these in the forefront, the importance of maintaining sentences which reflect the suffering if we do not act urgently and sufficiently. And also I question very strongly, again, the technical fixes which were being presented as if they're up and running, like carbon capture storage. That was a real fight in the last one. And finally, there is, and this is really important for those of you in the United States listening to this, there is a push for what we call not just geoengineering, but solar engineering. And this is being pushed by countries which are not rapidly reducing the drivers of climate change. So it's like saying, well, we'll do something that addresses a symptom. But these can produce what's called a novel risk. A novel risk is risks we haven't even identified because they could take us to another level. So that's also what we're pushing against.
Thank you. This is absolutely fascinating. It's really interesting. I want to know a little bit more about what you can do to help maintain the integrity of the scientists' findings in the face of political pressure. So kind of a little bit more about our role in that way.
So we as QUNO, throughout the year, not just in these meetings, we do a number of things. We are expert reviewers, or I am an expert reviewer, but not only, we have Frank on here, Frank Granshaw, so there's some Quakers, Laura Michaelis, who actually was an IPCC author, who also, when we give them access so they can also read. Expert reviewers can read the drafts and write comments That's one thing that we do. So that's before you get to this approval session. So we're feeding into these drafts saying, you know, where's the human rights-based approaches? Where is this? You haven't stressed this. That's one way. The second way is that when we're actually in the room, we can make a statement which says, we are concerned as civil society that the integrity of the science is being challenged here. And when you say that publicly, it's like putting the gauntlet down, because the IPCC has the right to say no. The authors have the right to say no. That's, again, I said this earlier, that's why I love it. In the UN climate change negotiations, there's no limit. There's no one who says, actually, no, we can't do that. The IPCC, and in many ways, is like nature's lawyer. So when the IPCC brings these reports to the climate change negotiations, it's like putting it on the table and saying, you may not want to act quickly, but this is what will happen. And that's why we cherish it. But it's also because they are able to say no. And they have a legal officer who can be pulled in, and was pulled in because they tried to silence the observers, that's another story, to say actually yes or no, this can go ahead, this can't. But we make a number of statements that says what the authors have said is very clear. We should not be cutting this. They continue to say this. We're worried for the integrity. And that is actually quite needed by just sort of on that public challenge scale. There are a number of states which are supporting certain things but couldn't say it publicly, but they like us to say it because then they can pick up and support that. We did a lot of work on rights-based approaches. And again, I'm an American by birth, so I am, and by childhood. But for example, we were trying to get more rights language into this last report. And we wanted to have meaningful, the word meaningful next to participation. It may sound small, but in a legal framing, if you've been asked to engage in a decision-making process, if you have the word meaningful, you can then argue that it wasn't meaningful. So these words are really important because these documents are being brought into court cases. And so we got support from the US to push for meaningful. We had the head of the US delegation saying, yes, but our Quaker friend was saying that we should have meaningful. I think that's important. So could we put that in? So you see, you're trying to pull in. We had a number of countries very concerned about the emphasis on nuclear, that it wasn't fully showing the potential dangers of nuclear as well as the positive sides. And we could also continue to bring that up and saying, is this fully covered? We can question, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions do not include military missions. Is this clear to the readers? So we can bring up issues that delegates might like to have said, but politically can't say. And the whole question of carbon capture storage, we kept pushing, and Germany picked it up and then wouldn't let it go. And so the language became much stronger about the fact that this isn't available to scale the way it's being presented by some, because the fossil fuel extraction dependent countries don't want to reduce particularly oil and gas. So they're looking for ways to pump it into the ground for the CO2.
Thank you. These insights are so helpful. Maybe just sort of a brief question, because our time is ticking on. You talked earlier a bit about prioritizing climate justice findings and protecting and making sure language on human rights and Indigenous people's rights is included. And are there other voices at the negotiating table also speaking up for these issues? And who are they?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, on a civil society level, Can Climate Action Network obviously pushes for very strong issues too, but the human rights voice tends to be ourselves and the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And we were getting them to speak in when they needed, but we were also using their language to then send off to delegates we knew that they didn't, so that negotiators had the exact language to then present. We had, in terms of countries, India, for example, will be very good on equity and climate justice, pushing it in there, as long as it doesn't have a national implication. They want it for international statements, less on national, but at least you've got them pushing that question, pushing for protection of small-scale farming. Canada and New Zealand in the last years have become much more politically supportive of their Indigenous peoples' populations. So we had Canada and New Zealand recognizing that this wasn't even in the last report and bringing it in. Every time you ask for things to be highlighted of new language, you have to justify that it is in the underlying text. You have to quote where it is in the underlying text, otherwise they won't listen. So you have to do all the homework of having read that and saying, you know, this is what we see, but it's not reflected in the summary, but it's critical. The European Union, they will support human rights. Finland, wonderful. Norway does, although Norway is the most fossil fuel dependent extractors, so there are other things they're not so vocal on. The USA was very strong on public participation, but of course they won't talk about human rights, but you can get them to talk about public participation and meaningful participation, because of course politically in the last couple of years they've learned some important lessons on that. South Africa was very good on concern for nature-based solutions, which is something else we can talk about, but it was able to put it in context and in a footnote to show that there are concerns there. And the Caribbean, and again, this is climate justice. These are all climate justice issues in terms of the Caribbean voices are extraordinary, pushing for 1.5. They will not let go because they will be, their island, their communities will be extinct. They are the first in the line if we don't hold temperatures to a safer level. And so that is a climate justice issue, and they are fearless, and they were going through the night because they were going from midnight at night all the way till noon in order to cover some of these, and also supported human rights. So those are some of the states to support. The European Union is okay, but they could be pushing some of those things more as an observer. They are allowed to speak European Union, but in the IPCC, it's individual countries. Germany will speak, Luxembourg will speak, etc.
Thank you. That's great. So my last question for this part of the conversation is thinking ahead to October and the final part of the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which is due. And I sort of want to understand, how important do you think this report is going to be? It's going to be summarizing all of the findings from these summaries for governments meeting ahead of COP27, the climate summit, which is going to be held in Egypt.
When the IPCC reports come out, they are incredibly influential. And again, between these assessment reports, we had a unique situation where we had 3 reports from the IPCC. One was about holding to 1.5, whether that was possible, which was a yes, and what would be the difference between 1.5 and 2 in terms of species, human impacts, nature, etc. And we also had one on land and one on the cryosphere, on ice and seas. And they each had a major impact. Coming into the COP, it's Egypt, but it's Africa. This is an African COP. Now, it's unusual because Egypt, of course, is probably listening more to the Middle Eastern brothers and sisters. There's a challenge there. So we need to really support the African voices. And the reason that this report is critical is it's saying, if we carry on the way we are, we're looking at above 3 to 4 C, possibly 5. But already things have been implemented in ways that in 2014, the 5th assessment report said if we just carried on the way we are, we would go up to 4.8 C by 2100. What they're seeing now is they're saying, well, it probably would go up to a high 3, early 4. So I'm not saying that's good news, but it is to a certain point that they're actually reducing by 2100 that. But it's really important you ground it in, if you carry on the way you are, if you follow in what the Paris Agreement, what people are promised under the Paris Agreement, then they're looking at between 2.4 Celsius to 2.7 Celsius, depending on what figures you're looking at, by 2100. And that's if you had the money, if you had the political support, etc. So what the IPCC reports tell us is we are not acting fast enough. We are not funding the poorer countries fast enough in the way that the Paris Agreement promised developed countries would fund developing. The NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are way out of scale for what needs to happen. And also they're saying renewables are the cheapest way forward. It is phenomenal what you can do. Diets are important, sustainable economies. So while we were fighting, and I use the word fighting in these sessions to keep language, what we do have is we have the clarity and the witness of what you can do now urgently and effectively to hold the temperatures to a safer limit. The question is whether the states will do it, but you've got the witness there on the table that says, if you don't, this is where you're going, and this is what will happen. And Africa is one of the most vulnerable areas, so it's really important that that voice is strong there.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. It's quite, well, it's so interesting hearing and learning more about it and getting a clearer picture of what actually happens. And I just feel so grateful and appreciative that this work is happening in our name, and to you for all you're doing. I have finished my questions, but we've had some brilliant questions sent in advance from participants. So I would like to start with the ones we've received ahead of time, and then we will open up to audience questions. So please start thinking. But the first question I have for you, Lindsey, came from Jane Sloan, and she says that she wants to ask if and how Quakers engage with the UN Centre on Diverse Women's Climate Leadership and gender inclusive approaches to climate action and climate finance.
Thank you. So when we talk about gender, it's one of what we call a human rights-based approach, which is our main push. And when we say, if you do climate action in a way that is a rights-based approach or human rights-based approach, again, that's language we got into this report for the second one. It would be gender, biodiversity protection, human rights, Indigenous people's rights, just transition. These are all considered human rights-based approaches. So we are pushing that. There are incredible voices working specifically on gender in the UN negotiations, but also we were the one pushing gender in the IPCC with the Office for the High Commission of Human Rights, and that's how we got it into gender equality for a language. But gender is probably the most supported and active of all the human rights-based approaches in the negotiations. They have their own constituency, they are super in. And what we do with QUNO is we try to find places and areas which are not supported sufficiently. And that's where we push. So the gender side is well out there. And of course, when we do quiet diplomacy, we always try to make sure that it's gender balanced. But I feel that that's one space which has super strong engagement. And also within the committees at the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations and the Paris Agreement, they have someone who is their gender point, who comes in and trains everyone in the committee to engage on what is gender relevant and gender supportive and gender inclusive. And we did a paper in January, which looked at supporting gender inclusion in renewable energy climate action. So we support where we can in that specifics, but I think they are one of the best supported right now.
Thank you, that's helpful. We had a series of questions from Wendy Jones, and I'm going to just ask them as she'd written them. So I understand that America lobbied the IPCC to exclude weapons from emissions counting. Would you be aware of any lobbying or measures taken to counteract this? And also, does the IPCC measure the environmental effects of war in general? If not, are there lobbies that try to remedy this, which include us? That's the first question. So I will, do you want me to ask all of them?
No, I'll do that one and then go to the next, because it's my understanding, and this is before my time, when they were defining what goes into the NDCs, and it wouldn't surprise me if it was the US, it may not have only been the US, but to keep military missions outside of nationally determined contributions. So if your country, or when your country gives its nationally determined contribution, it does not include military missions. It is now very much being talked about. We supported the European Quaker QCA, Quaker Council for European Affairs, in January, looking at this and talking about it. And we're looking at it more in QUNO about what would we say, because we don't want to say, just green your military. We want to really highlight how those emissions are not only killing people, but they are also killing our longer term chances on this planet. So they are not in our NDCs. The voices are stronger in that, and QUNO will be part of that. The question is, where do we want to say it? Where is the place where it's not being said? So the IPCC, in terms of influence, they are looking at the emissions, but I brought that question up in the mitigation about, are those emissions, is it clear to readers and to policymakers whether or not those emissions are included? They're also, for example, aviation. Aviation emissions are not just CO2. So is that clear to policymakers? And German Watch was trying to get that in. So the lobbying is there also, and the COP26, just briefly, was a ring fencing of oil and gas. And when I say ring fencing, basically they focused on coal in their decision they wanted to phase out or phase down coal. But that's a poor country's fossil fuel these days. They did not include oil and gas in saying we will phase down fossil fuels. They said we'll phase down coal. What we're seeing now is the wealthier countries, which are engaged in oil and gas, are not phasing down their oil and gas. And we're seeing those pushing of technical fixes rather than saying we are going to reduce our oil and gas. Anyone in the UK can see that happening everywhere here, right? But of course we now have an energy crisis, so it's harder. But my understanding is you can't get planning permission for an onshore wind farm or even turbine if you want to do community energy in the UK. It's bizarre, some of the policies coming. So that's why the IPCC is helpful, because you can quote that to them, and then you challenge the lobbying, because the lobbying is everywhere.
Thank you, Lindsey. Another question about lobbying from Wendy was that I believe the nuclear lobby lobbied the IPCC to include nuclear energy as green. And would you know if there are lobbies against this, us included?
Well, if you say the IPCC collates peer-reviewed science reports and then brings that into, they look at what's being said, what are the latest findings, and they bring this into the thousands and thousands of pages. Now, these are not scientists paid to do this. They volunteer their time worldwide, and they choose scientists to reflect both gender and geographic diversity. And so when you say you lobbied the IPCC, I mean, those scientists have the right to put in what they want, but they will bring in, there'll be scientists who, maybe coming from the nuclear industry as well, but they will be in a group for the renewables, everyone in there. Then they bring up the peer-reviewed language, and then they bring it into a summary. Where I saw that the lobbying for the nuclear was actually the opposite, in that it was being challenged in this latest summary report. So the last third working group, the mitigation, they had a whole chart of the most effective and cost-effective and ways to mitigate. Wind and solar were way at the top, but nuclear was looking more, in the language and also in this chart, was looking more viable. And it was actually countries in the EU, now not France, obviously, with France being very strong on nuclear, but it was countries that were questioning that the way they talked about nuclear did not recognize the cost to the radioactive waste after, and who pays for that. So often there's this thing that nuclear is actually cheaper, but it doesn't include the tax money that is used from citizens to then pay for long-term radioactive waste, and also the concern over the security of having nuclear in terms of the security on the military side. So actually what I saw in this last report were a number of countries, primarily EU, questioning and wanting stronger language to reflect the concerns of nuclear. So that's what we were seeing. And they brought in stronger language to say, Yes, nuclear is an option for some, but it is by no means an easy, simple solution. We have issues here. We have financial, we have security issues, which do not make it the most viable option. If you had the money, you would look at the other options.
Thank you. I've got one final question from Wendy, which is a great question, which is, do you know what following the COP26 recommendations would mean in practical terms, or even more so if we followed a zero emissions path? Would we survive?
So the IPCC was saying something that that has struck me. I mean, over the years talking to the scientists, and one thing they say is every half a degree counts. Okay, this is not about if we don't hit 1.5, we're all dead. Sections will be profoundly affected. It's about, this is the window we have to really influence a safer temperature rise. And as one scientist said to me on the land report, he said the difference between a 1.5 and a 4C rise is the difference between a manageable and an unmanageable or unimaginable. And so when someone says, well, it's too late, I say, no, it's not. Actually, this is the time. And our kids are going to say, what were you doing when you still could influence it? Because if temperatures go up to a certain level, what happens is you switch, for example, land becomes not a sink, but a source, which means wildfires, methane release, permafrost, you name it, starts actually, then it goes out of your chance to influence it. So this is the time to act urgently, to keep where we can, since we're driving it, those to transport those root causes which are driving the drivers of climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the way that we have degraded our environment, which it's all linked together. And so I would say it's not too late. If we look at the COP26, I would say it was shifting us to a very dangerous political shift. It was a developed country, UK, and the government in the UK right now, the kind of all these promises, which actually did not mention renewable energies, did not mention rapid reduction of fossil fuels, only the phase out of or phase down of coal. If you look at what the UK declarations were, they were all about technical fixes. Yes, deforestation, that was good. Yes, on methane, but it wasn't saying reduce extraction of fossil fuels to reduce the methane release. It was better technology to make sure we don't allow methane to release in ways that we don't want it. So you could see the writing on the wall, and you could see that coming into the IPCC in terms of some states wanting, and Saudi Arabia, is really the nightmare in these IPCC reports, because they do not give up. They just keep pushing for language that makes it weaken a bit on the fossil fuel side. They're not the only ones, but they're the most vocal. And that's what we're up against, of saying, no, we have to rapidly reduce now, but we have the options that are there. And that's the IPCC message. The reduction of cost in renewables was completely unexpected. And what they're seeing now in changes. And yes, with diet, look what you can do. And look what you can do with reforestation and restoration of land. Look what you can do with reducing consumption. With circular economy, with sustainable economic systems, with sustainable agriculture. All those messages are there if you want to hear them.
Thank you, Lindsey. Got one other question, which is around faith groups at the IPCC, or our role with other faith groups. We've also had a similar question come through from Rajan Naidu, but the question that I received in advance was from Bernie Jordan. And the question is, as QUNO is the only accredited faith-based observer organisation actively engaged in the IPCC negotiations, does this give Quakers a responsibility to speak for other faiths and also to encourage them to enter more into the discourse? And is the IPCC aware of other faith-based responses to the human crisis, such as Laudato Si?
Now, we are the only faith-based accredited active. Christian Aid is part of CAN International. So there are faith-based organizations which are part of CAN International, but you've got hundreds of voices then have to come to the IPCC and have one person speak for them. So we have a responsibility for that faith voice. And when I say the faith voice, I mean suffering, ethical choices. That is the language that we're constantly putting out there. And I've had IPCC, the secretariats and authors thank us for bringing up these issues continually, because nobody wants to talk about suffering so much, unless you're from the small island states, then you will talk about your existential. But it's this weird space where that faith voice is critical. So yes, Christian Aid, they have some excellent people who feed in, but FWCC is not a member of CAN and therefore speaks independently. The Holy See has the ability to be, they are an observer if they want to, but they don't get active. And I'll just, a quick thing, I actually had a co-chair of the IPCC back in Katowice, so a couple of years in 2018 now, at the COP, who said, why aren't the Holy See saying something about the human, the suffering and the, why we have to act fast? And he said, can you say something? I said, well, oh yeah, I know some of them, so I'll ask them. So, because the Holy See has the right to speak, like, almost like a state. So I talked to the two men sitting there in the Holy See space and said, the IPCC is really wondering why you don't speak more, about this, what's happening. And the next day they made a big statement. So it's kind of encouraging the different voices. Quakers, when I think of the influence or the space we have there versus what could be there for an interfaith voice, it's critical. And the interfaith work is very important for us in the Paris Agreement. It's very strong there. But the IPCC, it's less. And so that space is about the ethical, the human impact, the impact to nature, and consumption. Let's talk about how we're living on this earth.
Thank you, Lindsey. There's another couple of questions which have come through in the chat. So what is your analysis about why the UK messages were so inappropriate and destructive, e.g. the political links? And how can we as everyday people lobby and work towards changing that? And I think a linked question perhaps from Julia, what are your 3 points for us to take away? So sort of what can we do in support of you and your work and more generally?
So on the UK, and I don't work on national issues, we work at the multilateral, but I am married to a Manchester man, and I'm often back in the UK. The COP26, what we're seeing in a country like the UK, it's not just the UK, but you've got North Sea oil, you've got fossil fuels you make money on. The governments in the last decades have, and this started with primarily with Thatcher in my memory, but going on, is to use that money to keep taxes low, right? So Norway used fossil fuel extraction and actually have a trust fund. The UK has used that to subsidize their politics. And what's really scary is that, we're seeing licenses. We're now got, Gove is talking about the coal mine in Cumbria. Maybe we will now accept that. So you're seeing the hypocrisy of, and if I am correct, because I was talking to a number of friends who are trying to do locally in Britain, community energy systems, community-owned renewables, that it's very hard to get planning permission for a turbine. But part of that is also because your utility companies are all privatized. So it's very hard when wind farms come up, they put out 30, and those are 40 turbines on a hill that don't actually source the local communities. So Denmark, for example, is very good examples of putting turbines that directly feed into the local communities, so you have more support. So UK, is the political push to say it is cheaper, it is actually more cleaner than what our policies are doing. The UK is pushing for carbon capture storage to maintain their fossil fuel extraction, which helps financially, understandably. You have this energy crisis now, but you could be doing so much more with renewables. The nuclear issue, you may choose to have a mix of nuclear, but what we're seeing is that they want to have mostly nuclear. So I think I would look at the politics of it, look at the papers, and do what Greta Thunberg did, which is basically she was given a chance to speak to the US, one of the committees at the Congress, and they said, can you hand us the list of questions you're going to ask? And she handed them an IPCC report and said, read the science. I would do that. I would send them the report. For the 3 points, big question. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, we also have the awareness of what a transformation takes. We don't have to wait for that. And the transformations are about how we are living, those mostly the wealthier, how we are living on this earth. Now, Kenneth Boulding, all of you know, the American Quaker in the 60s was talking about the spaceship Earth. So the messages are, we don't have to wait. We have the science, we know what's happening, and we know what we can do, but it also requires that we are part of that witness in our lives, but in our politics. So that would be one takeaway, that when I say it's not too late for catastrophic global climate change. It is too late for certain regions. They are already experiencing catastrophic, and if temperatures go to 1.5, which they likely will, there will be areas that can't cope with that already. But everything we do now is about making sure it doesn't get even worse. So it is not too late, the time is now, and our young people are asking us, what are we doing? And the third point, walk cheerfully on earth. You know, this sense of the Quaker, I think the Quaker grounding is, it's not about shaming, it's about being a witness, and it's about encouraging, and it's about almost giving that spiritual side of why this is so critical. Because I know colleagues in Extinction Rebellion say we had some Quakers that really helped ground us spiritually of why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that's a huge contribution to what we're doing, and the protection of nature, the cherishing of God's creation, whatever language you're comfortable with, is that this is for the long-term life on this planet. It's all we have.
Yes, thank you. I think we probably have time for one more question. And there's a question from Gray, Southern in New Zealand. Public response is a key issue for the rate of transformation. And it seems that what looks like apathy is really fear of their anxiety. And is there any consideration of such issues?
Yeah, and Gray is, it's been a wonderful support to this work. And also, Gray, I don't know if FWCC can share out some of the spiritual work that you're doing with New Zealand Quakers on climate change is a wonderful model. It is all about fear. And I think if maybe another takeaway is working in your communities with interfaith groups, like inviting the faith groups in your community to talk about what are we afraid of? Yeah, what do we fear? And how do we move beyond that fear to embrace what we can do? Because we don't like talking about fear. But one of the questions we ask when we bring the negotiators together over the Paris Agreement and the implementation was, one of the first questions is, we said, so what was the fear that you brought to this session? You know, and when you start talking about fear, you start letting it go. So I would say, talk about the fear and anxiety, and talk about also the story of what we can have if we act, right? What are the healthy things that we can do better? If we carry on the way we're doing, think of the air pollution, think of all the other ways of your life is included that you want to actually live more healthily. And so there's a positive story that also needs to be told rather than the fear story, because in the end, if you're only about fear, people just shut down. And you've got to give them the story of how we can have a better life, which we can. With the understanding that temperatures are going to rise no matter what to a certain degree. So it's the reality check, but the awareness that we can also keep it to a certain level while we have a chance.
Thank you, Lindsey. I feel like an hour is never enough time. There's so much more we could talk about, but we will have to draw it to a close for now, but this is an ongoing conversation, and I look forward to doing more sessions with you and with friends around the world to keep this conversation going. There will be a video of this session, a recording, available online in the coming weeks, and we can email it out to you if you registered in advance. And I just also take this opportunity to remind friends that any donations to FWCC and to QUNO to support this work are hugely appreciated, and you can donate through our website or through QUNO's website, and I will pop a little link in the chat for anyone who is interested. Thank you so much to you, Lindsey, for your time, and I will invite friends to join in a moment or two of silence as we close. Lindsey, was there anything else you wanted to add at this point?
I just saw a question about why I keep 1.5 alive. I think I just wanted to share on that. The window is closing, there's no question. But we keep 1.5 alive because there's an ethical reason. If you can actually still have a chance at that, then you have to challenge ourselves and our politicians about why are you not going for that. And also, the more that you are talking about 1.5 and pushing for that, you may have a chance for 2. Do you know what I mean? There is the constant need for urgent, healthy, sustainable, we call rights-based, but for doing this in a way that transforms so that we actually do it in a way that's healthier. So we do keep 1.5 alive. We know the window is closing dramatically, but that doesn't mean to say that it's impossible now. One of the things I just want to say that you be aware of is something called overshoot. Countries will say, we'll allow overshoot, so you can go up to 2.5, but somehow we bring it down. And what I said, quoted in the IPCC in one of the sessions, I said, you can't bring the dead back. So, you know, we have the IPCC records what would happen between 1.5 and 2, and again, species extinctions, etc. We have to do everything we can to keep urgent and rapid action and healthy and rights-based, so that we are including people. It's a community action in this too. But I just wanted to answer that. Yes, it's closing, but we hold to that when we know that we have what we need to do that.
Thank you, Lindsey. Okay, well, we have reached the top of the hour, so I'm going to suggest that those of us who can stay on for a few moments of silent worship together and upholding Lindsey and your work can do that now. But if you need to leave, please feel free. And thank you all so much for joining.